So we have our cafecito, we have our empanadas. I like to call it pastelillo. Um, let's start with a lightning round. And in one word, I would like each of you to describe colorism. And I will start with you, Griselda.
Painful.
Sad.
Traumatizing.
Colonialism.
Psychological.
Insidious.
Another word, another lightning round. Tell me how it feels when you're subjected to it.
Traumatizing.
Confusing.
Painful.
Rageful.
Traumatizing.
Perplexing.
Thank you for that. Something that I think we oftentimes hear about in the Black community. It's talked about in the Black community, colorism. Easily almost. There's the racism's discussed, but colorism within the Black community. In the Latino community, not so much. Why is that, do you think? Felice.
So I think that there's this facade, really, conversations about colorism are really about a deep-seated issue that has gone on for centuries, really. And at times, those who are actually impacted by it, perhaps are dealing with their own traumas.
Well, do you think that it's because Latinos feel, well, we can't be racist?
Oh,
We're people of color.
Of course. I think that I think that there's a facade, and there is a facade that Latinos cannot be racist, right? So we're mixed people. We are all different things. Racism, huh? What? Colorism, huh? No way, right? But we know that that's not true.
What do you think?
Yeah, I
Griselda?
completely agree. I think it's this indoctrination that Latinos are one, which is false. And then as in this notion of being one, we believe that it is a family, so it's almost like we're airing dirty laundry. So we kind of like brush it under the rug out of shame. And I don't think it's denial, because I think most know, but it's denial
Right.
and shame in revealing that like thing that, colonialism left us with.
Exactly.
That I think it makes us less likely to talk about it.
Caridad, do you think that you have ever benefited from the way you look?
Absolutely. And that's why I know that I have a privilege because of the color of my skin. I've been able to, blend, assimilate, or, people assume that I'm not even Latina sometimes. And, I remember working at a diner and they thought I was Greek. And, I didn't tell them my name was Caridad. They called me Carrie. And I didn't correct them because I was like, I'm never going to see these people again. But I was privy to the conversations they were having, the venomous conversations they were having. And I carried that with me. And I used my privilege to help the disempowered, to help the oppressed. And, it's really up to white people to make this difference for us. The way they need to hold space for people of color, the way that men need to hold space for women, because that's a whole other issue, but white people need to hold space for people of color.
I will tell you, I think oftentimes we use these nicknames in our community, right, in the Latino community, Blanca y Negra, and we try to convince each other that these are terms of endearment. Growing up, I was the darkest in my family because my father's African American. And I would go to PR, my mother's from Puerto Rico, and they would call me Negrita. And constantly tried to convince me that it was such a wonderful, beautiful term of endearment. But I was the only one on the island that was being called that in the family. And I, pushed against it and would say, why is it a term of agreement, a term of endearment for you to say to me that I'm the little black girl in the family? Why? And so I ask you, have you had that experience in your family where, you're the lightest one or you're the darkest one and you're treated differently in the family?
I think, just your example is so important because it just shows how relative colorism is, where I think when someone's street race is black, when phenotypically, as a person of Latin American descent, my example is always like my family owns beauty salons and I walk in and maybe a darker skinned Dominican sis walks in, they won't assume she's Dominican. They'll assume I'm Dominican. But so there's this relative, like, contextual colorism happening because my twin sister and I, especially on our dad's side, we were the negritas, and our word of endearment was bruja. Ironically, we're now the brujas of Brooklyn. Ay, esa bruja, that witch. Our hair has always been curly, and they'll be like, y tú pareces una bruja, you look like a witch. And there was always like a racial undertone
Right.
to that word.
Because since when is a witch a good thing, usually?
Now. Now it is, but it's right, and then we move into other spaces where we're the lighter ones. Right, so it's all contextual because within certain families, especially in the Latinx community, phenotypes vary.
Let me ask you this, because there seems to be a common thread in my mind. The reluctance to be associated with anything African based, right? Because at least for Puerto Rico, we are a blend of African, Indian, Native, as well as European. But you ask any Puerto Rican, many Puerto Ricans, to take claim of their African heritage, and there's a resistance. The term Afro-Latina, I think, is very new, or Afro-Latino is very new, that being embraced. Why is there that pushback and that denial of all things African, do you think?
Yeah, I think just the pervasiveness of anti-blackness globally, and then we compound that with colonialism, and it's very analogous to Mexican origin folks, Chicanx community. We use those terms of endearment like negrito or indio or güero or güerita, right? And those are really remnants of colonization that still negatively impact us today. I think it's really important that we analyze that and come to that understanding. What do these palabras, what do these words, these identities really mean that are placed upon us? And how do we, decolonize that and work with that,
And to love ourselves
Definitely.
in all the
yeah.
complexity and the richness of it. And let me ask you, Hatpa, because you have just such an interesting background. First of all, you're gorgeous.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
You look every bit of the model that you are. You did not know your true heritage and identity for a long time because you grew up in a lot of white spaces, right? And then you
Yes.
sort of went on a journey to find your identity. Tell us about that.
Well, when I was a child, 1 year old, I was adopted alongside my twin brother by two white dads. And we were raised in an all-white town in the Bay Area. And growing up, we always had questions about our identity and why we looked different than our family, because everyone was European, everyone was white. And this curiosity led us to self-discovery, and we wanted to learn why we look different. And it led us to our indigenous roots.
And what did you find out? Who are you? How did you describe yourself?
I describe myself as indigenous,
Indigenous.
yes. And I'm indigenous from Mexico. Yeah.
Do you consider yourself Latino?
No, I don't.
Indigenous is how you identify.
Yes.
And there has been that movement now, right? You get to identify who you are, which I think is
Yes.
spectacular. Let me ask you this is for the twins. I know you're a twin as well,
Yeah.
for Miguelina and Griselda. Something that has always been very interesting to me is people from the Dominican Republic. Because I dated a guy when I was in high school who looked to me to be African American. He looked black. And I would say, Louis, I won't use a last name, you're black. And he would say, no, I'm not black, I'm Dominican. A full-on rejection of anything, again, from Mother Africa. Why is that, do you think? I think it's pretty complicated. I know that it's pretty complicated, especially from the Dominican Republic.
Yeah.
But why do you think that is?
I mean, I think Sean alluded to it about this is global white supremacy. When you look at the fact that European powers colonized a large chunk of the world, so it's a legacy of that. And then I think a nuance is that we share the island with Haiti.
Yes.
And anybody that knows anything about like Pan-African Black history, you know, that's the seat of like Black liberation on the Western Hemisphere. So Haiti has been punished for claiming their liberation. And I think that DR has then been upheld as like the golden child of the island because we've been socialized to think that we are not Black, right? There's currency in whiteness when we think about white supremacy. So I think for Dominicans, it's the conditioning that whiteness would afford them the luxury of survival. And then it's reinforced in the US because you find the anti-blackness among all people that are colonized. But I think the insidiousness that you find among Dominicans in particular is because of our relationship to Haiti.
And I think, sorry, go ahead.
We have that antithesis, right? That we're not Black because they are Black. But most of us get rude awakenings when we migrate outside and people are like, oh, you Black. And I think it leads to some of us, not all of us, to then claim that identity.
And I think you also have to speak on Trujillo,
Right.
you know, modern day dictator from 1930 to 1961. And, you know, I share this not to make excuses and excuse my people for their behavior, but it was a harsh dictatorship for 31 years. And one of the main goals of his authoritative regime was to whiten the Dominican culture. You know, slaying and assassinating hundreds of thousands, close to a million Haitians and Black Dominicans. Because, you know, in DR, we're taught that Haitians were massacred. Dark Black Dominicans were massacred as well. And that was yesterday. He was assassinated in 1961. And, you know, that legacy prevails. Our lifetime. My mother was alive. My mother's the youngest of 11. Her sisters were alive. And my mother's family is phenotypically dark-skinned. So they lived that regime in a very particular way where, like my sister says, whiteness and adjacent to whiteness was currency. It was safety, right? So then they bring that here to the States. And, you know, unfortunately, some people in my generation and younger, they still carry that torch, you know, but we're here to like break that curse because it's a curse. Because it's like, there's a chunk of me that I grew up and it was missing. Like, oh, los dominicanos, we were colonized, somos españoles, la madre patria, the motherland is Spain, and then embracing our Taíno-ness and our Arawak and Carib ancestors. But then there was this piece missing. Yes. And then when we reclaimed a vital piece, like I know my sister and I, we came alive because we're like, wow, this is not only a missing piece, which is important, but in our lives, it was a really big
crucial.
Piece. It's crucial. And it makes me sad that some of my people may never experience that in their lifetime.
Yeah. Mother Africa.
La mama.
I think it's important also to acknowledge, you know, the dynamic of racialization that we've all been subject to in light of our, you know, respective culturas, our respective origins. As Mexican origin people, as Chicanos, I know my parents went through an Americanization process where their names were changed, you know, the cultural practices of indigeneity, growing our hair long. You know, my mother was forced, you know, her hair was cut in the schools, as were all the young Mexicanitas in K through 12 schools in the United States. So that phenomenon in the Southwest, that Americanization process, you know, still has negative impacts on our psyches. And
that's such an important point. The Americanization and the need to assimilate to try to survive. I mean, my real name is Asuncion. It's not Sunny. Mm-hmm. But who pronounces that, right? Mm-hmm. And in order to survive in this industry, in journalism and television, I was told that I should change my name. No one in my family calls me Sunny. In fact, my grandmother would always say, Sonny, ¿qué es Sonny? ¿Qué es eso? Because that's not my name. And I want to switch gears a little bit to colorism in pop culture, because when you don't see yourself on television and in magazines, that I think is very destructive as well. And I do remember, for me, never seeing anyone that looked like me, and until recently, really, we're seeing a little bit of that. And I was just recently asked to be on the cover of a Latin magazine, which I was shocked at because I was rejected for years from the cover of certain magazines because I wasn't Latina enough. So my question to you is, when you see that the biggest Latino stars are usually more white appearing, what do you think of that? When does that start to change?
I just want to add, we have to look at the history, because there's been a blanqueamiento, I believe is what's called, a whitening, right? And this was derived through the caste systems in which the Spaniards basically forced all people of color to go under, which was a racial hierarchy, which the Spanish people born in Spain, the peninsulares at the top, right? And then you have the criollos, the Spaniards born here in the Americas, right underneath. And then you have castizo, someone who could be 1/4 indigenous or African and 3/4 European. Then you have mestizo or mulatto, right? Someone who is half black, half Spanish, or half indigenous and half Spanish. Then all the way at the bottom, you have indigenous and you have African. Because we were seen as lower, we were seen as animals, we were seen as dogs. You know, and for me, that's why I claim and identify as indigenous, to reclaim that part of me that has been stripped away.
And there's power in that.
Yes.
There's such power in that.
I also think that, to piggyback off of that, it's important to note that with that pigmentocracy, right, so with that racial caste, it is that you have those who are lighter and favored who were able to be upwardly mobile, right? So there are laws, right, in terms of jobs that you can get, in terms of education, in terms of Afro-spiritual religions, etc. And so there was sort of this pathology, this idea which still continues today, and we see it in communities. You talk about Dominican communities, the Dominican hair salon. I have stories about Dominican hair salons, right? And the understanding these beliefs that you have bad hair, pelo malo, right? And you walk into a salon and leave traumatized, you know? I could remember literally the last time that I went to a Dominican hair salon, you know, the woman walked out, my hair was on Biggie, right? I didn't have a relaxer anymore, and one woman, you know, washerwoman, was hemming and hawing in Spanish about my hair and about how her arms were tired and how, you know, pelo malo. And we finally got to the process where, you know, I was being rolled up, I was dried, and I was ready to be blow dried. And a woman, you know, blow drying my hair was a bit more smoke than usual. And I remember her saying quemado. And so she was saying that my hair burned. And so there was a strip of hair that turned from my hair color to the color of bone. Wow. And it fell from this point to the tip to the ground. And so this woman, my hair was burnt. I was so traumatized, and I think you could hear it in my voice. I'm still very traumatized by that experience because I am a dark Black woman in this salon who you know, understood exactly what was going on, but wasn't comfortable enough. I was young, so I wasn't comfortable enough to talk back in my Spanglish, you know, and kind of let her know that I understood what was going on. And deeper than that, she saw me, she saw my color, and automatically thought pelo malo, made assumptions about the texture of my hair, how much heat it could take, and as a result, it was burned literally on the ground.
Wow.
And so this is indicative of a much deeper issue of colorism, right? And it's gone on for centuries. When we talk about the caste, when we talk about today in countries where, you know, we have police who are killing Black Afro-Latino people in Brazil. You know, there have been some famous cases in Colombia. And this is all indicative of the same racist system that has gone on it's ingrained.
Because the thing with colorism, and sis, thank you so much, because Oof, I felt your story, not personally, but I just felt that you were traumatized, and thank you for sharing. And this is how lethal colorism is, because it's like from calling you negrita and güero to burning your hair in a salon to killing you on the streets, right? Because there is a power dynamic there. So this conversation needs to be had. And going back to the question you asked earlier, why is colorism not discussed as much? My sister and I were college professors, and we teach Paulo Freire, Brazilian activist, wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I always teach from that book. And we don't want to identify as the oppressor. We don't want to identify as the oppressor who's oppressing our own kind, so we sweep it under the rug. And we think, oh, white people are the oppressors, or some of us think, because some of our people still aren't there. We think white people are the oppressors, and we never consider that we have played that role one way or another. Your word earlier, insidious. Colorism is insidious. It kills you slowly because you either benefit from it and you stay shut, you sit there and you discriminate against your own kind, but then you're like, oh, I was just kidding.
Yes.
It's just a term of endearment.
It's a term of endearment.
But our people are dying. Black Latinos, Latinas, Black Latinx people are dying at disproportionate rates in this city, across Latin America, in this city. When we talk about COVID, the number of deaths of, the Latinx community, right? But then when you disaggregate that and you look at the data for Black Latinx folks, it's staggering, it's alarming.
And do you think, in a sense, I think Sean sort of alluded to this, is colorism used as a vestige of colonialism to separate Black and brown people?
I think so. And I think we really have to take into consideration when we look at mass incarceration. We have those same experiences and those same disparities, that we're, incarcerated at higher rates than the white community. And equally, simultaneously, we're underrepresented in higher education. We're killed at disproportionate numbers, both Black and brown communities. So those are things I think we really have to take into consideration and seek the root of, what are the origins of that? And I think it goes back to, a lot of it goes back to colonialism and those ugly tools of colonialism like colorism that are definitely still at play and that adversely impact both Black and brown communities.
To piggyback off what he's saying, and I just want to applaud everyone who's saying what they're saying, because I feel it. I'm in the moment right now, so thank you guys. The same goes with people south of the border, because you have these kids in cages, right? Mm-hmm. Being raped and murdered. Mm-hmm. And they're calling them immigrants, but the fact of the matter is they're brown and they have indigenous blood to this continent. Mm-hmm. They're not foreigners on their own turf.
Right.
But they're being treated as such. Mm-hmm. And for me, that hurts to see, because, this whole colonialism, I like to use this metaphor. When the oppressor takes a billy club and hits you over the head, right? And you wake up and you don't quite remember who you are, right? And then they tell you that you're an immigrant. They tell you that you're from someplace else, right? But you have brown skin. These people look just like me. Mm-hmm. And I'm close to full-blooded indigenous, Mm-hmm. And they don't recognize who they are. It's easier to separate them from their land and their families themselves. It's a genocide of the mind. It's a genocide of the mind.
It's being erased, and that actually is a tool of colonization.
Exactly.
We didn't cross the borders crossed us, right?
Exactly.
Dehumanization, it's systemic, it's purposeful. Creating psychological terms, like there was actually like a human scale. They had human zoos putting people, indigenous people and African people on display, even here in the Bronx Zoo, the Otabenga. This was like in 1906, and they had him, living with the apes, as if he was not human. I learned about my Blackness through the music, through the Yoruba tradition, through those songs, is that I learned because I felt it and I knew it to be true, that that the Blackness lived in me. And and even though through religion it happens too, like how they've whitened Jesus, when Jesus was a Black man. Those are all ways to to disempower our being, in our strength to strip us. So yes, anything that makes us richer, they villainize. So that's why, of course, women that didn't believe in these religions are called brujas, right? So through the art, through the music, that's where I felt empowered, and that's why I used poetry and used that as the tool to awaken the masses, and called myself La Bruja for that same reason.
My grandmother was called La Bruja, so I loved that about you.
It's, you
And
know,
you.
I wrote this poem, I too am black. You know, color lines run deep in my veins. Behind covered mouths, I've been called many names. Instead of hope, they taught me shame. But I chose to play another game. With ears I hear, but heart unchained. You could keep it or take it all back. You have eyes, but are blind to the fact that I too am black. The oldest human is black. The further you go back, it is black. And until we embrace that, we will always be broken as a human, as a being, as a collective consciousness.
Yes.
Until we realize that, you know, we will always be broken. But I do believe in this generation, in this time. I do believe it. I
Yes.
see it. I mean, the fact that we're even discussing
That
this
we're
right
discussing
now
it.
is monumental.
And it is being discussed now. And I have to talk about Felice, because she started a conversation that reverberated around the Latino community. I was in our Hot Topics room at The View, and I start hearing there's a woman, Felice, and she's calling out in the Heights. And she's saying that why are there no dark-skinned Latinos in this movie? And I had just seen the movie myself. And we all love Lin-Manuel, okay? He has done wonderful, wonderful work. But I will say, having grown up in New York, I had the same observation. Why are there not a lot of people that look like me, right, in this movie? And I think he did the right thing by saying, you know, I may have missed the boat on this one. I screwed up. Tell me about that moment for you, because you really, you said what needed to be said.
So thank you for that. I do, first I want to acknowledge that there are so many, Afro-Latino people who have been saying this conversation about colorism and anti-blackness has gone on in various circles, activism, academia, the arts, media. But what made this special was that I had the opportunity, I had the access to the cast. And when the trailer dropped in December 2019, Twitter, I am a member actively on Black Twitter.
Yes.
And in the conversation, people went wild. And as did I. I'm like, what is this? We are supposed to be in the Heights, and we're supposed to be representing, Dominican community. And there were no folks who were visibly black aside from Benny's character. And that was immediately a flag. And, kind of went on, saw the film. And it confirms our fears in that way, or what we saw in the trailer. And the conversation about colorism is just so deep. And it is absolutely, it was a huge moment for Lin-Manuel. We wanted him to win. But we cannot unsee the fact that there were no dark-skinned Latino people who were leading in the cast. They did not have storylines. They were in the background. They were dancers. They were in the salons. They were in the kitchens where we tend to be, right? Which is so saddening. And it really was infuriating. And there were points of the film that I loved. My abuelita passed away, so the scene with abuelita resonated. But I cannot see that film and not want to say something. I could not have done that, especially when we're in a moment where we understand that Black lives across the globe, across the diaspora, we matter.
I felt a little erased.
Absolutely. Where were we? So we were seen, dancing, but absolutely not heard. Our humanity wasn't explored. And this again is about the larger issue of colorism.
Let me ask you, Sean.
I think we have a
what do you think?
responsibility as being folks who have a conciencia to counter those negative images. into how do we develop a positive image of self and community amongst and with and for young Black and brown youth. You know, how do we counter this anti-Blackness that's so pervasive in our community? So, as an educator, as a teacher in South Central Los Angeles, I'm privileged to work with Black and brown families, Black and brown youth, and that's my main goal. I work with this real sense of urgency to develop a positive image of self and community, and develop strong, fluid identities amongst our students. And as myself, as a colonized person, I do that. So it's really a co-construction of that, right? How do we embrace our indigenous being as Mexicanos, as Chicano people? How do we embrace our Blackness as Black young folks? You know, so that's the beautiful thing about this, is that we have agency as our respective communities, as a Chicanx, Latinx communities, and so yeah, and that's where I work from. That's a position, and my positionality where I work from is definitely to facilitate those processes of decolonization, of rehumanization, and how do we love ourselves.
Well, that was where I was going with this, because I know you're an educator. Well, we have a lot of educators. I think we're all educating. You're educating in the field of fashion now as well, where there is such limited representation. I mean, who looks like you? Who has that beauty in fashion? I don't see it very often, right?
I can't think of very many Native models, to be honest.
So, you know, where do we go forward from here? Because I think about my children. I have a 19-year-old and a 15-year-old. My husband is from Spain, and his mother was a Spaniard, his father Haitian. And then I'm Puerto Rican and African American. My children look like no one you've seen. And I allow them to identify in the way that they are most comfortable. And they are, in their minds, Afro-Latino, right? This is a different generation. How do we move forward with this pervasive anti-Blackness, self-love in many respects, I think? How do we move forward?
I feel we move forward by uniting, because a lot of the same sentiments you guys are talking about, the anti-Blackness, is the same south of the border in Latin America with being indigenous.
Yes.
They say, I'm not an Indio, Indio feo, ugly Indio. And a lot of these people have very obvious indigenous features.
Right.
And yet they're hating on themselves, essentially, you know? They're saying, I'm not an indigenous person, they lost. I want to identify by the colonizers, the ones that defeated them. So I'm not this anymore, I'm just Mexican. But Mexican is just a nationality. That's a nationalistic identity. Our identities are so much deeper, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years deeper than that here in this continent, you know? And there's a power knowing that you breathe the same air that your ancestors have breathed in the same lands since time immemorial. And that's what I want to do with my modeling. I want to influence people of color to be proud of where they come from and to reconnect with their roots. There's nothing to be ashamed of.
That's right.
What we have to realize is that racism is equal to ignorance. It's not just hatred, it's ignorance. So
And sometimes it's willful.
it's willful, it's cognitive dissonance too. Like what you're talking about is, you know, is separating from what you know is true, but holding on to a different belief, you know, and what we just have to share to the world is that, you know, there's a much wiser way, you know, to get back to the land, to the old way. There is health in there. Like our world is falling apart. You know, we're more dependent on drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, than we are on nature, where we burn forests and destroy that way of living. You know, there are still, you know, very small tribes that still exist, and here we are forcing them out. There's genocide still happening today. You know, we have to go back to the land, go back to that old way. That there is, to me, there is the answer. And, you know, the moment you feel hatred for somebody else because of how they look, you have to check yourself. What is that about? Why am I hating? Who taught me to hate? Because it's taught. It's not inherent in you to hate. You know, when we're babies, we're not born, you know, feeling self-conscious of ourselves or looking at our skin or looking at each other for differences. We're looking to connect. So we have to get back to that root.
How do we move forward?
This conversation is a major step. I think this network, like seriously, I said it earlier, like I really didn't know who you were until you came to the View, and I was like, oh, okay, a sis, right? I'm watching. You know, I think that's important.
Sign me up.
And so I think that this conversation is a major start. And I'm a, you know, also express the thought that was put into ensuring that the diaspora that is associated with the Latin American subcontinent was represented, because that's also an issue. I grew up in New York City where we watched Univision.
Yes.
And it wasn't until I kind of like visited Mexico that I was like, oh, not every Mexican looks European.
Yes.
The telenovela
Representation.
Mexican, right? The telenovela Mexican. So I think this conversation is a start. Is a crawl. I don't think it's a step. It's like we're crawling, but we're still moving.
To me, spirituality is the way I move forward, because I dabble in this world of, you know, learning, understanding, living, teaching colorism, racism, oppression, genocide. And when you teach it, you live it. You speak it, you read it, you grade it. So to me, my spirituality, my Kundalini yoga is the way that I heal, but I can't just sit on my mat like, and I can't kid myself to think that chanting on a mat and saying, you know, spirituality, we're all children of God, and I'm black just like you, that's not gonna do it. And the last thing I'll say is the revolution must be centered in love. It must be centered in love.
In labels, right? I don't think we haven't found the right term to describe us. We have Hispanic, then we have Latino, then we have Latinx.
Latinx.
You know, I was thinking about Latinx. The only way that I could really adhere to Latinx possibly is if the X stands for what Malcolm X's X stood for, because we still have not found it. But the fact that even the census forces us to fix and find ourselves in boxes, I feel is so divisive.
Yes.
Until we can get rid of forms of, you know, surveying the people in those ways, when we can get rid of that, then we can really start making progress, because that is not what we are made of. That's not what separates us. It should not separate us in that way. You know, it has to be on, you know, human level. Human basic levels, not these terms, you know, am I this, am I white, am I black, you're human. They're like, what race are you? I'm human, I'm the human race.
I don't know when we ever get there.
I think that another way to heal, in addition to having, you know, conversations in these spaces, having conversations in your family too.
Yes.
I was on the phone, you know, with my father, with my uncles, with my aunts. I was like, did Abuelita ever tell you about colorism and cute? Like, what was this like? How was Abuelo? How did this all work out?
Yeah.
And to go back to the theme of, you know, it's being so taboo, it really, really was. Conversations really, people, you know, during that era were trying to survive. They were trying to thrive. They were trying to have money to be able to pay for food to put on the table.
Yeah.
And that is so real. And when you have systems of oppression, literally, you know, in some cases, you know, led by the government, which don't allow you to really ascend economically, then it's like, yeah, you cannot take the time to have the conversation to heal because you're too worried about grinding. And that's just a reality. That is very much a reality. So when we talk, and even intergenerationally, and really like make the space for it, just listen. I was like, I'm just here to listen. I'm a journalist, and I have these questions, but if you would just talk and share a bit of your experiences and a bit of what Abuelita may have told you, or Abuelo may have told you, and or, you know, your take on this all. I think that the conversations have been, at least in my life, truly instrumental, and it's helped me to understand, really have a deeper understanding, aside from my own experiences, but have the context to see why, okay, they didn't talk to you about this because they were trying to survive, to make sure that you can make it, so that you made sure that I could make it.
So maybe that's the way forward, having more cafecito conversations, right? Maybe.
I think going back to our you know, from a Chicano perspective, going back to some of our indigenous traditions, you know, that are right in front of us every day. You know, the very food we eat, right? The
Yes.
nopales, the tortillas de maíz, the beans. And then ironically we say, oh, I'm not Indian, I'm not indigenous. Well, what are we eating, right?
Yes,
What is,
where did it come
even the
from?
Mexican Spanish, how, you know, it's so infused with indigenous language to some of the cultural practices, some of the indigenous ceremonies I found have been effective in countering, you know, the negative effects of colonization on urban Chicano youth, engaging in the temazcal, the sweat lodge ceremony, engaging in danza azteca, engaging in singing, you know, these indigenous cantos that you know, allow us to embrace that indigenous being and those indigenous realities and our origins as, you know, Mexican people. So I think that is one way I've seen a healthy, effective way in addressing, you know, colorism, addressing colonization, etc.
Well, I have to thank you all for sharing your stories, sharing your thoughts and yourselves with us today.
Thank you.
That's all of you.
Taino tea.
Thank you.